Welcome back to Chess Dog. This is John Montgomery, and as I laid the groundwork at the end of the last video, this is the final round of the Southwest Open. And if I win, I'm going to win the under 2,200 prize, or at the very least, a good share of the under 2,200 prize of $750. And I was sure who I was going to be paired against. It was actually a friend of mine, someone I've known for many years, played a lot of blitz into coffee house against, and he had the game next to me in the previous round. He was due the white pieces. I was due the black pieces. Like I said, we're in about 100 rating points of each other. So I just knew I was going to be paired against this guy. So for about 45 to 50 minutes before the round, I already knew what he played because he played so many games. I prepared the line to battle him. I knew I'd have the black pieces. And the pairings didn't come out. The pairings for the lower sections had come out, but the pairings weren't coming out for the open section, the top section. And I kept waiting, knowing who I was going to be paired against, of course. And when about 5 minutes, I would say, before the round started, the pairings come up. And it is not my friend at all. It is instead Razvan Priotu, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, the only Grandmaster in the tournament. I came into the tournament 2160. He was like around 2560. And he was the one GM. There were about 5 international masters. So this was a pretty strong tournament. And it just so happens he'd had a rough tournament. Every once in a while, even the Grandmaster has a tough tournament. And he had lost a couple of games to the IMs when they had been paired. And because of this, the Grandmaster and I actually had the same score at this point. So instead of having the black against an old friend who I felt who was a tough opponent, but I was capable of beating, I now have black against the #1 seed in the tournament, the Grandmaster. That's a pretty tough hill to climb. Now, I have, in my tournament history, a couple of draws against Grandmasters in rated tournament play, and both of those draws did come with the black pieces. So there's at least something I can hang my hat on. I'm not intimidated. I'm just going to play my very best chess and see what happens. He opens with e4. This was the first e-pawn game of my tournament, and I was glad to see it. I like the e-pawn, even though I didn't play it in this tournament. I play the French defense, d4, d5, knight to c3, the main line. Bishop b4, the winner variation. Black is looking to unbalance the position as much as possible. I'm willing to give up my dark squared bishop, which is a valuable piece, but in return I'm going to mess up his queenside pawn structure and create a lot of imbalance and potential for complexity. He advances in the center, the main line. I challenge the base of the pawn chain at d4 with c5. a3, bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, and here we have our standard win-over structure. Black's structure is healthy and strong, but I don't have that bishop. My opponent does have the dark squared bishop. Knight to e7, and he plays h4. There are a few moves that can be played here. Queen to g4 is the most mainline move, attacking g7. But he goes ahead and plays h4. And h4 basically is just gaining space on the king side. White can still handle it in different ways. White could still play queen to g4. He can play some of the more positional lines, but he's gaining space on the king side first. I play queen to c7 with threats down the c file. Pawn takes pawn, queen to c3 check is a possibility. He plays rook to b1. Now if I were to check on the c3 square, attacking the king, the rook would not be vulnerable in any way later in the game. Knight b to c6, h5, and now I'm already kind of at the limits of my theory. I understand the concepts, the ideas and the maneuvers in this position, but in terms of concrete theory, I'm about towards the end. The first thing I do know is that in this line, if white plays h5, you need to play h6. You can't let white go ahead and play h6 and wreck your kingside dark squares, particularly after you've already given up your dark squared bishop. Now he plays queen to g4. The same idea as in the other line. He wants to attack the g7 pawn. Now, I play knight to f5, a very common and not a bad move here. But after this game, studying it, I learned of a very cool little trick for black. I wish I had known it during the game. My Grandmaster opponent, I'm sure, knew it, but I did not know it. I learned this from Anish Giri's Chessable course, actually. Really cool. So my concern here is if I defend g7 with rook to g8, my fear is he's going to come in with the bishop to d3, and then if I kick that bishop, he'll just play bishop to h7, hitting my rook. And then when I move the rook, queen to g7, and I'm just lost. The game would already be over at this point. But what that trick was that I learned after is that you can actually go ahead and go into this as black, but white has a cool, as black, but black has a cool trick. c4, bishop to h7, and you don't move the rook. What you do is you play knight takes e5. Now this knight is attacking the queen, so white can take the knight. You can also play queen to g3, but it's still good for black either way. Pawn takes knight, queen takes e5, which is a check from the king on e1, so white has to address that. Knight to e2, then rook to h8. The queen on e5 defends the pawn at g7, so the white queen can't take it. And the bishop at h7 is trapped. Every single square along that diagonal, all those green highlighted squares, are all covered. And black is already slightly better here. After bishop to d3, you just take it, and black has a slight edge. But unfortunately, I learned about this maneuver after the game was over. So I played knight to f5. The knight defends g7. He plays knight to f3. Yeah, my idea was that if he played bishop d3, I'd play the other knight back here. So he plays knight to f3, bishop to d7. Bishop to d3 is played. Knight c to e7. Now queen to f4. Now what he wants to do is clear the way for this g-pawn to kick that knight. And at the moment, that knight would have no square to go to. First thing I do is I kick the bishop with c4. What I'm trying to do, you notice I've completely locked the structure. And one thing about the winner or French, it's an opening where you violate a lot of basic principles. That's one of the reasons why it's so tricky. And the basic principle black violates in this line when it's played well is that black actually attacks on the side of the board where white has more space. Black will often play f6 or g6 to open lines on the king side and attack down those files. You don't do that very often in chess, but in this line, you do. But I have to make room for that knight at f5 or it'll be trapped. So I move the knight back to c6, g4, knight f e7. Now a4 is played. He wants to perhaps make room for this bishop at a3. I play queen to a5. What I want to do is force this bishop to d2 to defend the c3 pawn, and therefore it won't have access to this a3 square anymore. And I was kind of proud of my idea. This is a normal idea. And here he played the move that shocked me, king to d2. He keeps his king in the middle of the board. And basically, he has all of the trumps. He's got more space, he's got the two bishops, but his king is in the middle of the board. There's no way I'm going to be able to get at that king unless I sacrifice material or try to find some way to open lines. So I play the rook to f8. What I want to do is play f6 and open a line of attack on the f file. He plays bishop to a3, which is possible because he played king to d2. And I played f6. And this is a little premature. It's a little early. He takes, with the pawn, a better idea might have been bishop e7, knight e7, rook to b7. I can play the bishop back, but here, my king is the one that's got more questions about where it's going to find safety than white's king. White's king is perfectly safe there in d2, much to my frustration. So f6, ef6, rook to f6, queen to e3. Now I play queen to c7. I don't want this bishop to get on this d6 square. It's a very comfortable square for that bishop to be on that diagonal. So I play queen to c7. He plays rook h to f1, and now I realize pretty much what his plan is going to be, and I don't see any way to stop it. What he wants to do is play this knight to e5 and support it with the f-pawn, and then roll these pawns forward on the king side. And it's I don't know any way to stop this plan. What I try to do is arrange my pieces so that I can play g6 and maybe open up some lines to keep those pawns from advancing. I castle long first, knight e5, rook to h8. I want to defend h6 so I can play the g-pawn up. a5, bishop e8, again to play g6. a6, b6. I don't want to open the b file. f4. I played g6. He takes on c6, I take on c6, and now g5. Things are not looking too good for the home team here. The Grandmaster's kingside pawns are rolling, and I'm in big trouble. That's just a fact. hg5, fg5, rook f1, rook f1. I play gh5. I do not want him to get a protected passer on h6. That would be very bad. gh5, g6. I play queen to d7. If I go ahead and take this pawn here, and he plays queen to e6 check, and also attacking my bishop on g6, and I lose that piece. So I can't take that yet. Queen to d7, rook to g1, rook to g8, bishop h5, knight to e7. Again, trying to put as much pressure on that g-pawn as I can. He takes the knight at e7. Queen takes e7. Now, I fought back pretty hard here. I was at one point, according to the computer, down as much as +5, and now I'm down plus 2.5, you know, 2.5 pawns valuation. That's still clearly losing. But it's better than it was, and, you know, I'm doing the best I can. He plays queen to e5. Now, that turns out to be inaccurate. Black has a strong move here. And it's a move I missed, and it's kind of an ironic move when you think about it. What I played was bishop to b5, and that's just losing. Well, remember earlier, my opponent played the king to d2, and that shocked me. Well, if I had been a little more keen about my Grandmaster's ideas, I would have realized that the best move for black is a mirror move. I should have played king to d7. I should have defended the e6 pawn with my king. And what I'm doing is threatening queen to d6, offering the exchange of queens. Now, it would be less than around a +1 advantage for white. So all of a sudden, I would have worked my way into a window where a draw, while difficult, would have been possible. The idea, again, is to play queen d6 to exchange queens. If he plays queen to b8, then king to c6, and black would defend the pawn at a7 with the queen laterally. But I did not do that. I played bishop b5, and now I'm in very big trouble. g7, now I play king to d7. It just made sense to me to move the bishop and then defend with the king, but I should have defended with the king immediately. Rook to g6, and white is just piling onto that e6 pawn. I'm in big trouble. Queen to d6, a tempo too late over the other idea. Bishop g4 continues to pile on to the e6 pawn, and in this position, I resigned. The game is completely over. Computer something like +10 for white. I simply have no chance. A continuation of queen e5, de5, and there's no way to defend e6. The rook can't come over because the pawn would queen. And so the Grandmaster won a game. Now, I have a question, and you can mention it in the comments section if you'd like. Given the choice, in my shoes in that 7th round, would you have rather have been paired against someone who was around your own strength with a real chance of winning some prize money? Or would you rather have been paired against the much stronger player, someone who could test your limits and help reveal to you where you stand and how strong you are, and really help you learn something about the game, but also know that the chance of winning prize money is almost zero? It's an interesting question. I'll be interested to see what you think about it. And listen, if you click the like button if you haven't already, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog and following my Southwest Open experience. I'll be back soon with new videos on some players, some of whom are probably a little bit better than me. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye.